This conference is now being recorded.
Welcome to the New York State Association of School Business Officials webinar. Today's program is Sales Tax Reporting Webinar. Your host for today is Donna Clement, Director of Professional Development with New York State ASBO. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing #. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions during the presentation using the chat window indicated by a speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. Please address chat questions to the Q&A group using a drop-down list located at the bottom of the chat window. I'll now turn the call over to our host. Donna, please begin.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone to our webinar on sales tax reporting. We were very pleased that Jamie Johnson and Tony Salerno of the New York State Department of Taxation, the Taxpayer Guidance Division, were available and very interested in doing this webinar for us. I know there's a lot of questions that come up about sales tax reporting on the extra class activity funds, so get your questions answered. I know some of you sent questions in to us, and we really appreciate that. But as you're hearing the information, if you think of something, use your chat window here to send us the questions. So we look forward to this webinar, and Jamie and Tony, it's now time to begin.
All right, very good. Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for participating. Again, my name is Jamie Johnston, and I'm a tax regulation specialist here with the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. With me is Tony Salerno. Tony is a tax technician with the department, and Tony's also the head of the department's Sales Tax Exempt Organizations unit. We've been asked to speak today by the New York State Association of School Business Officials about New York State sales tax as it relates to schools and school districts and sales tax reporting. I'd like to thank Donna Clement again for asking us to participate in this. Hopefully we'll be able to get a lot of good information out to you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Much of the information that we're going to speak about today that we are going to present is contained in a publication that we just drafted. It's called Publication 843. It's a guide to sales tax in New York State for exempt organizations. And this publication, as well as all of our publications, memorandums, forms, and other tax guidance, is available on the Tax Department's website at www.nystax.gov. So let me forward a slide here to keep up with things. I don't know why, but the slide is not moving forward, so hang on just a moment. Maybe we can do it this way. Well, let's skip the slide, but hopefully it'll take care of itself. First off, I'd like to talk about the different types of exempt organizations that there are under the tax law. And under the tax law, there are two different, what we'll call classes of exempt organizations. And the way they purchase and sell products and services are treated very differently. Although there are other types of exempt organizations, most exempt organizations that we deal with are either governmental entities, which are state agencies, instrumentalities, public corporations, and political subdivisions, or what we call religious, charitable, educational, and other exempt organizations. We'll discuss both types of exempt organizations and how they make tax data models and whether the sales they make are exempt or subject to tax. First, we'll talk about the governmental entities. Again, let me see if I can navigate this PowerPoint. All right. There are two types of governmental entities. There are United States governmental entities and New York governmental entities. The buying and selling rules are the same for both, but We'll mainly discuss New York governmental entities, especially since that's what public school districts fall under. New York governmental entities include state agencies, public corporations, political subdivisions such as counties, cities, towns, villages, fire districts, and school districts. Public schools and school districts in New York State are considered governmental entities under the tax law, and therefore they're subject to the rules that govern purchases and sales made by New York governmental entities. New York governmental entities are not required to qualify for exemption from sales tax. As governmental entities, they are already exempt under the tax law, so they're not required to file an application requesting to be sales tax exempt. Organizations that are not sure whether they qualify as an exempt organization or as a governmental entity may contact the tax department and will help determine the organization's exempt status. Although all New York governmental entities are exempt from sales tax, governmental entities from other states other than New York, are not sales tax exempt. So a school district or a public school from New Jersey or Massachusetts, for example, comes to New York State, purchases hotel occupancy, purchases tickets to a Broadway play, and buys restaurant meals, that organization, that other state governmental entity is required to pay sales tax on all of these purchases. Okay, purchases by New York governmental entities. In order to make purchases exempt from sales tax, a governmental entity must be the purchaser, user, or consumer of tangible personal property and services. An employee of a governmental entity, while on official business, must be the occupant of a hotel room or a patron at a place of amusement, club, or similar place. New York governmental entities, and certainly school districts as New York governmental entities, are not issued tax exemption numbers. We get a lot of calls from a lot of governmental entities looking for their number, and we can't give it to them because there isn't one. When making tax-exempt purchases, New York governmental entities, as purchasers, users, consumers, occupants, or patrons, must issue to vendors a governmental purchase or a requisition or the appropriate exemption document. And there are several exemption documents that governmental entities can use to make tax-exempt purchases. Now we'll discuss those exemption documents and the other exception a governmental entity may use when making tax-exempt purchases. The first form we'll discuss is Form AC 946, Tax Exemption Certificate. This form may be used by employees of governmental entities for purchases of property and services. In order to purchase the property or services exempt from tax, the purchases must be made on behalf of the governmental entity, and the charges must be incurred in the performance of an employee's official duties. An example of a situation in which you might use this form is where, say, you're out of town at a meeting and you need to purchase stationery supplies or copying services. You would give this form to the vendor in order to not pay sales tax on those purchases. One thing that's interesting about this form is this is not a tax department form. We don't have a form similar to this in the tax department. This form belongs to the New York State Office of the State Comptroller. It's still a viable form. It can still be used. It's tailored to governmental entities and employees, but you can't get it from us. So in order to get this form, you can access the form on the Comptroller, New York State Comptroller's website at www.osc.state.ny.us. The easiest way to get this form once you're on their homepage is by typing in AC 946 in the search box. This is a small form. It's not a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet form. 3 of those forms will fit on an 8.5 by 11 page. So don't be confused if you print one of these out. You can cut it into 3 parts and use them. It's not the easiest form to use, but again, it's not ours, but it still serves a purpose. Another form that's used by governmental entities is Form ST-129, Exemption Certificate, Tax on Occupancy of Hotel Rooms. This exemption document is used by employees of governmental entities to purchase hotel occupancy exempt from tax while on government business. As a government employee, you must be able to properly identify yourself in order to use this form. Another form, or not really a form, but another method of making tax-exempt purchases is the use of government purchase orders or requisitions. These would be specific to each governmental entity. There's no standard form for this. Really what's important is that it identifies the governmental entity as the purchaser, and that's good enough for the vendor to grant sales tax exemption on the purchase. Another way that a governmental entity can make tax-exempt purchases is with a government credit card, and that's going to show that the purchase is being made and billed to the governmental entity. So that's another acceptable form of documentation for an exempt purchase. I'll just try to make the slideshow catch up with us here. Please bear with me. Another thing that we have that will facilitate exempt purchases, although it's not an exemption document, is what we call a governmental entity letter, and that's something that we compose here in the tax department. As I said before, the tax department does not issue exemption numbers to governmental entities, but we realize that most vendors expect an organization to provide them with an exemption number to associate an exempt sale with the organization. So what governmental entities may do, and a lot of them have done this, is request a letter from us, and we'll issue a letter showing that showing the vendor that the governmental entity is exempt from the payment of sales tax on their purchases. You obtain this letter by calling us at the tax department or writing us, and the letter is issued by Tony Salerno's unit, the Sales Tax Exempt Organizations unit. If you wanted to call up and request a copy of this letter, you can call us at 518-457-2782, and I'll show that number again later. That's the line into the Sales Tax Exempt Organizations unit, and they'll be able to print you a copy and create a copy of that letter for you. The letter itself identifies the organization as a New York governmental entity, and it states that governmental entities are not issued exemption numbers. So you'll be able to show that to the vendor that you don't get a number. It states that the organization is exempt from payment of sales tax on its purchases, and it further states that the governmental entity may give the vendor a copy of the letter as confirmation of the organization's exempt status. And it tells the vendor that the vendor only needs a purchase order or other evidence that the governmental entity is the purchaser in order to not collect tax. Although this governmental entity letter is not an exemption document per se, it will satisfy the needs of the vendor to be able to document the exempt sale. There is an instance where a governmental entity must pay sales tax when it makes a purchase, and that's where it purchases motor fuel or diesel motor fuel, because the tax is already included in the gallon price, and it wouldn't be practical to back out the New York State sales tax portion at the time of purchase. When this happens, the purchaser is entitled to claim a refund of the tax paid. There's another instance form, actually, that the governmental entity may use to make tax-exempt purchases, and that's a resale certificate. That's a tax department form ST-120. That can be used by governmental entities that are registered to collect sales tax. And registering to collect sales tax is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Not having as much luck with my presentation of PowerPoint as I'd like, but we'll try to stick with it. Since governmental entities are not issued tax exemption numbers, they may not use Form ST-119.1, Exempt Organization Exempt Purchase Certificate, which is the form that these other exempt organizations, the religious, charitable, educational, and other organizations use to make tax-exempt purchases. We'll discuss that form later. There's a lot of confusion about this because, as I said earlier, in most instances, vendors are looking for exemption numbers to associate with exempt sales. Now we'll discuss the Teacher's Choice Program briefly. I'm having trouble with my my slideshow.
Jamie, I can take control from you.
Can you, and just, I can just speak to you when we need to advance it, or if you can just follow along. I can't get it to advance.
No problem. What page should we be on now?
The one that we're on right now.
Perfect.
Tax-exempt purchases, Teacher's Choice Program. A public school teacher is an employee of a New York governmental entity and may make purchases of school supplies on behalf of the governmental entity exempt from sales tax. An example of this is purchases made through the New York City Department of Education's Teacher's Choice Program. In order to make the purchases exempt from tax, the teacher must present the vendor with a government purchase order or the other appropriate exemption document. Next, we'll speak about extra classroom activity funds. I know there's been a lot of discussion about this, probably a lot of questions. Extra classroom activity funds are funds raised other than by taxation or through charges of a Board of Education for, by, or in the name of a school, student body, or any subdivision thereof. Basically, extra classroom activity funds are those operated by and for the students. Monies are usually collected voluntarily by pupils through various school-related organizations and are spent by them as they see fit, as long as they abide by established guidelines. For the tax department's purposes, if the school district controls the use of the extra classroom activity funds and the school clubs or organizations that generate the money that's part of the school or school district itself, any purchases or sales involving these funds would be considered purchases or sales made by the governmental entity. An extra classroom fund itself, say an organization, a student organization, would never be tax exempt unless it's independently organized, formally organized, and requested exemption from the tax department. Generally, what we see is the school district making the purchases, and in that manner, the school district can make sales tax exempt purchases because it's a governmental entity. So to make the tax exempt purchases, these clubs or the school itself, who's ever making the purchase, and when I say clubs, I would mean acting as the governmental entity, they would present vendors with a government purchase order or a requisition or the appropriate exemption document as we just discussed. The vendor just needs to be able to associate the sale to the school in order to not collect tax. We had a question that was submitted previously about how an extra classroom activity fund gets a tax identification number, and if the fund is looking for a number from the New York State Tax Department, it will receive a sales tax identification number when it applies for a certificate of authority to collect tax, that is, register as a sales tax vendor. We'll discuss how to register as a sales tax vendor later. Tony will discuss that. Another question that we had regarding extra classroom activity funds was whether the sales tax collected by the extra classroom activity funds of all the schools in a school district could be remitted under one sales tax identification number. I spoke to members of the audit division on this. I didn't get a definitive answer, but I think we can say pretty conclusively that the department would rather see this money sent in under one tax identification number than for us to force individual schools to register as sales tax vendors. I don't think that's what we want to do. So I think it'd be perfectly acceptable, and maybe it's the way it's being done for some of the districts now, to remit that money under the school district's tax ID number if the school district has registered as a vendor. If I could advance a slide, please. Next, I want to go on to sales by governmental entities. Sales by New York governmental entities of property or services that are not ordinarily sold by private persons are exempt from sales tax. This is a situation that almost never comes up. Our sales tax regulations provide the following example of a non-taxable sale by a governmental entity. States in the regulations, a county clerk sells tax maps, copies of ordinances, and certified copies of documents. The sale of these items is not taxable. The reason is the only place that these items can be procured is at a county clerk's office. But this doesn't come up very often, and I don't think it would come up at all with school districts selling things. On the other hand, sales by governmental entities of property or services that are ordinarily sold by private persons are subject to sales tax. And as I said, this is much more often what occurs. This means that in most instances, any sales of taxable property and services made by governmental entities, or in this case a school district, are subject to sales tax. As I said, I can't really envision situations where a school would sell something that is not ordinarily sold by private persons. So I advise that if you're going to be selling anything, register as a sales tax vendor and collect and remit the sales tax on any taxable property or services sold by the school. I think we can advance the slide again. Bookstore sales. Good, there we go. Sales of taxable products and services made at a school bookstore are taxable in the same manner as if the sales were made at a store owned by a private vendor. Most sales made at school bookstores are subject to tax, provided the school itself operates the store and is making the sales. This means that the store has to collect tax on sales of review books, pencils, pens, paper, and other normally taxable products. The same rules apply for food products and beverages sold at bookstores. Sales of cookies, granola bar, peanuts, popcorn, potato chips, pretzels, milk, fruit juices, they have at least 70% natural fruit juice, vegetable juices, and medicine such as aspirin, Tylenol, cough medicine. Those items are exempt from tax when sold at a bookstore because they're exempt from tax when sold by anyone. On the other side, sales of carbonated beverages such as soda, bottled water, fruit drinks, those that contain less than 70% natural fruit juice, Gatorade, lemonade, Yoo-hoo, heated beverages such as coffee, tea, hot chocolate, prepared sandwiches, candy, and gum are all subject to tax. We have a publication that's on the Tax Department's website, so if you need more information about which foods and beverages are taxable and which are exempt, refer to our publication 880, which is taxable and exempt foods and beverages sold at retail food markets and similar establishments. That's got a much broader list of things that are taxable and those that are exempt. Sales of clothing or footwear costing less than $100 per item or pair are exempt from the 4% New York State sales tax, but may be subject to local tax if the county or city elects to impose tax on those sales. Most counties and cities, I believe, have elected to impose the local tax now. There aren't too many that have opted out of that. But to determine whether or not your county or city imposes local sales tax on these sales, you can refer to our publication 718C, which is Local Sales and Use Tax Rates on Clothing and Footwear. And to determine which items of clothing are taxable, you can refer to our memorandum TSB M-06-6S. And that's year-round sales and use tax exemption of clothing, footwear, and items used to make or repair exempt clothing. That provides a list of commonly sold items.
You have to have everybody go out to I-4 and request.
School cafeteria sales. There's a specific exemption under the tax law that says sales of food or drink to a student of a nursery school, kindergarten, elementary, or secondary school at a restaurant or cafeteria located on the premises of the school are exempt from sales tax. So if you sell soda or fruit drinks in a bookstore, they're taxable, but if you sell these items in the cafeteria, they're not. It's a little quirky part of the rule, but generally any sales that you're going to make in a cafeteria at a school are exempt. Vending machine sales, I mentioned this. I don't think the schools themselves own and sell out of the vending machines, but vending machines, when located in a building, the schools may lease the space that the machines occupy to the owner of the machines for a fee. This payment is not subject to tax. This is more the rental of real property, so to speak. Student photographs. There's an example in our sales tax regulations regarding photograph sales, and I'll go over it. It says that a public high school contracts with a photographer to photograph the graduating class, and the photographer sells all the photographs to the school. The school will then sell to students. The sale of the photographs to the students is of a kind ordinarily sold by private persons, and the receipts are subject to tax, just like pretty much everything as we've discussed. In this instance, since the school purchases the photographs from the photographer and then sells them to the students, the school is considered the vendor for sales tax purposes, and the school must collect the sales tax on the sale of the pictures and remit the tax to the tax department. There could be instances where instead of selling the photographs to the school, the photographer sells the photographs directly to the students. In this case, the school doesn't take title to the photographs, but it collects the money for the photographs, including the sales tax, and hands all the money over to the photographer. In this instance, the photographer is considered the vendor for sales tax purposes, and the photographer, and not the school, is responsible for making sure that the right amount of sales tax is collected and remitted to the tax department. Fundraisers, another area of interest, I'm sure. Fundraiser sales made by schools or school clubs that are considered part of the school, and as we've said, everything with public schools is generally going to be considered a governmental entity, as opposed to independent organized clubs, which we'll discuss later. Any of these sales are subject to tax when the items being sold are normally taxable items. Commonly sold fundraising items that are subject to tax include candy, wrapping paper, books, and candles. These products are subject to tax regardless of how they're sold, so whether they're sold door to door or by taking catalog orders or from a table set up in the school, anytime the product being sold is normally subject to tax, the school is required to collect tax on the sale and remit the tax to the tax department. So sales of certain products sold at fundraisers are subject to tax, and sales tax must be collected. But you'll need to determine who is responsible for remitting the tax, as we did with the sale of student photographs that we just discussed. It's handled the same way with fundraising sales. Let's say, for example, a school is having a fundraiser where it's selling candles. It contacts Yankee Candle, and Yankee Candle sends the school sales packets including order catalogs. The students take orders for the candles, and at the time the customer places the order, students collect the selling price of the candle plus the applicable sales tax from the customer. When the selling period is ended, the school submits the order to Yankee Candle, and Yankee Candle sends an invoice to the school showing Yankee Candle's price charged for the candles, plus any shipping cost and the amount of sales tax due. The school then sends the amount on the invoice to Yankee Candle and keeps any remaining money as its profit for the fundraiser. When the order is filled, Yankee Candle sends the candles to the school, and the student delivers the candles to their customers. In a fundraiser like this, the school itself is not selling the candles because they don't take title to the candles. The school is acting as a sales representative for Yankee Candle. The school takes orders for the candles and collects the money, including the sales tax due, but does not take title to or has ownership, if you will, of the candles. So although the school is responsible for collecting the sales tax, it collects the tax on behalf of a registered vendor, Yankee Candle, who's the owner of the products, and Yankee Candle is responsible for remitting the sales tax to the tax department. Now, suppose the school district holds another fundraiser later that year where it sells candy bars. It contacts Hershey, obviously a chocolate distributor, and decides to order 20 boxes of candy bars. In this instance, say the school must pay the distributor for the candy bars before the distributor delivers them. In this instance, the school has purchased the candy bars and therefore has taken title to them. So when the students sell the candy bars to the customers, the sales are subject to sales tax, and in this instance, the school is required, students or school is required to collect and remit the sales tax to the tax department. So it's a little bit different. In that instance, It's the school making the sale, and in the previous instance with the candles, it was actually Yankee Candle making the sale. I know these candy bars come in a box that says maybe $1 or $2, and I've worked in offices for 20 years at the state, more than that. I have never seen anyone collect tax that I know of on the sales of these candy bars. But letter of the law, when you sell something like this that's taxable and it's a governmental entity making the sale, the item is subject to tax. There are some exempt fundraising items. Fundraising items that are exempt from tax include cookies and crackers, popcorn, as long as it's not sugar-coated or candy-coated, that makes it taxable. In sales tax, anything that's coated with candy or sugar is taxable. Gourmet nuts, again, provided that they're not candy-coated. Cheesecakes, entertainment-type discount books are not subject to tax. Merchant discount cards, gift cards, magazines, because magazines are exempt as periodicals under the tax law. So there are a number of products where you wouldn't have to worry about a sales tax collection responsibility. Another fundraiser that's typically held by a school organization is a car wash. And car washes are considered a service performed on tangible personal property and are subject to sales tax. Car washes are subject to tax when they're done by the school district because it's a similar service that's ordinarily done by private persons. The owner of a car wash that provides a hand washing service is required to collect tax. So if the public school does it, then they're also required to collect tax. And if we could advance the slide, please. Admission charges. Some admission charges by public schools are subject to tax. For example, the school is holding a dance or an activity night, the tickets are subject to tax. That's probably, again, something that not too many schools are aware of. However, the sale of school tickets to athletic events is exempt from tax, provided the proceeds of the ticket sales benefit the school. Sales of tickets to a school play or a concert are also exempt from tax. Sales by the school of admission tickets to an occasional dinner are also subject to tax. Not aspect of it. Dinner to raise money for the extra classroom activity fund. The school only holds one dinner each year. The sale of tickets is still subject to tax. I make the distinction about having only one dinner a year because if instead of the school putting on the dinner, an independently organized club, like a booster club that applied with us for sales tax exemption and was granted that, if they hold the dinner, the rules are different. And we'll discuss sales by these types of organizations later. Other school events. Food sales made at the school by the school itself may or may not be subject to tax. Say a local school holds an open house at the school on the night the district residents vote on the school budget. The school sells pizza, hot dogs, soda, and coffee at the open house, and the proceeds benefit the extra classroom activity fund. These sales are subject to tax because the items are subject to tax. If the school runs a regularly operated concession stand during school athletic events and sells food for consumption on the school grounds, these sales are also subject to tax. However, if the school holds a bake sale, the proceeds from which benefit the school's extra classroom activity fund, only the non-taxable items sold at the bake sale, and generally it would probably be all the items, are not subject to tax, provided they're sold for off-premises consumption. And I think at most bake sales, people buy stuff to bring it home. So bake sales generally would be exempt from tax. Parking sales. Sales of parking services by governmental entities are also subject to tax. So I don't think this occurs often, but if a public school has a function and charges patrons to park, those charges are subject to tax. I've never had to pay to park at a school function. I hope it doesn't come up often. The next thing I'd like to discuss is governmental entities doing business with contractors. This may not be something that the business offices get involved with directly, but it is an area that's provided some confusion. Generally, a contractor hired by a governmental entity, say a school district, to perform new construction or repair work for the school district, can purchase tangible personal property exempt from tax when it's to become what we call an integral component part of the structure of building. This means that a contractor can purchase products that become part of the building like steel, lumber, paint, drywall, all tax exempt. Products that are used in new construction or repairs that don't become part of the structure, like utilities, gas and electricity, tools, equipment rentals, cannot be purchased by contractors exempt from tax unless the governmental entity has appointed the contractor or a subcontractor as an agent for the governmental entity. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in just a moment. The reason I bring this up is because over the years there's been a lot of confusion surrounding this issue. So much so that we had to create a publication that sets out the rules to be followed in these situations. Many contractors and governmental entities mistakenly think that, for example, in the construction of a new school, anything that's purchased under the construction contract can be purchased exempt from sales tax because everything is going to the school, which is a tax-exempt organization. Several years ago, we discovered that a school-related governmental entity in New York had even created its own exemption document and gave that to contractors, saying just give this to a vendor and anything that you purchase will be tax exempt. Unfortunately, the tax law doesn't work that way. As I said, only when the contractors buy things that go into the building itself can they purchase tax exempt unless they're appointed as an agent. We don't think that happens often. We don't think school districts are in a position where they're going to appoint contractors as their agents. But in case you think that this may affect you or that you are appointing an agent, we have a publication that we've created. It's called Publication 765. It's Sales and Fuel Excise Tax Information for Properly Appointed Agents of New York Governmental Entities. So if you think this situation has arisen and you may be appointing an agent, please take a look at that publication. If we could advance the slide, please. Now I'd like to talk about the other class of exempt organizations. This isn't going to hit the public schools as much, maybe on the periphery a little bit, because it's not going to be the school itself making purchases or selling things. But the other type of organizations that we were going to discuss are what we call religious, charitable, educational, and other exempt organizations. These types of exempt organizations are sometimes known and referred to as 501c3 organizations. You may be familiar with that phrase because that's the section of federal income taxes that they're exempt under. Examples of these types of organizations include churches, museums, nonprofit hospitals, charitable relief organizations like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. School-related exempt organizations of this type would include private schools, which they're not governmental entities, parent-teacher associations and parent-teacher organizations, PTAs and PTOs, privately organized youth sports organizations, booster clubs, model UN clubs, which we get a number of them applying, the organizations that simulate the United Nations and teach students about civics. They'll apply with us for an exempt organization certificate on their own as an independently organized exempt organization. And also other privately organized school clubs like drama clubs, foreign language clubs, and key clubs, provided they organize independently. If we could advance the slide, please. School organizations that are not governmental entities, but instead exempt organizations, are required to apply for exempt status and are not considered exempt organizations until they have been issued an exempt organization certificate. We receive many calls from different types of organizations that believe that the fact that they're organized as a not-for-profit organization makes them automatically exempt from paying sales tax, and that's not the case. In order for these types of organizations to be tax-exempt, they have to apply for exemption with us, and we'll send them an exemption certificate. There are certain requirements, if we could advance the slide again, please, for these types of organizations. An organization that seeks sales tax exemption that's not a governmental entity must apply for exemption with us by filing Form ST-119.2, and that's the application for an exempt organization certificate, and provide the documentation that's required by that form. For instance, a prospective exempt organization must provide with their application their organizing document, say if it's a corporation, a certificate of incorporation. Probably it's not. Probably it's an association or a smaller type organization. Their bylaws, a statement of activities, which tells us what the organization does, receipts and expenditures, so we can see what they're spending their money on, and That's pretty much all we ask for, but we could ask for more once the application is made. There's more information about applying for sales tax exemption on Form ST-119.2-I, and that's the instructions for the form. Or you can refer again to our Pub 843, which has a large section on applying for exempt organization status. Making tax-exempt purchases. When these organizations make tax-exempt purchases, they use their 6-digit exemption number, which we issue on Form ST-119, which is the exempt organization certificate. This is a piece of cardstock. It's about a third the size of a regular sheet of paper, and it names the organization and contains the organization's 6-digit exemption number. This is the evidence that this organization is exempt from sales tax on its purchases. A vendor will typically ask for a copy of the organization's exempt organization certificate or its records when the organization makes its initial purchase from the vendor. When an exempt organization makes a purchase, it must also provide the vendor with Form ST-119.1, which is the exempt organization exempt purchase certificate. We could advance the slide, please. Copies of this form are mailed to the organization when we grant the organization's sales tax exemption. The form is not available on our website. We found that there could be a lot of abuse because there are a lot of organizations that incorrectly assume that they're exempt organizations. So we've made its use or its availability restricted. In order to obtain the form, you can call our Sales Tax Information Center or the Sales Tax Exempt Organizations Unit. Again, we'll show the number of that unit shortly. Any purchases that the exempt organization makes that are in furtherance of its organization's exempt purpose, that benefit the organization and what it's set up to do, are exempt from sales tax. However, purchases made for the benefit of members of the organization personally are not made for the organization, and they're subject to tax. When making tax-exempt purchases, the exempt organization must be the direct purchaser, occupant, or patron of record, and must also be the direct payer of record. Direct purchaser, occupant, or patron includes any employee or agent authorized by the organization to make purchases on the organization's behalf. And direct payer of record means that direct payment is made by the organization from its funds directly to the vendor. Qualifying as an exempt purchase, both the name of the organization and its employee, officer, or agent must be identified on any bill or invoice. Payment must be made using cash, a check, or a debit or credit card of the organization. An employee, officer, or agent of the organization may not use a personal check or personal debit or credit card to make tax-exempt purchases on behalf of the organization, even if they'll later be reimbursed by the organization. With these exempt organization certificates, there are some general rules that have to be followed in order to remain an exempt organization. The exempt organization certificate applies only to the organization that has applied for and was granted sales tax exemption. An exempt organization certificate may be revoked for any reason constituting misuse of the exemption, or if it's discovered that the organization's application contained misleading or deceptive information. If an exempt organization changes its purposes, activities, organizational structure, etc., it must notify the department and will issue a new exempt organization certificate provided that organization still qualifies for exemption. If an organization changes its activities, or if it changes its organizational structure, for example, reorganizes as a limited liability company, which this probably isn't going to happen too often with school districts, it must also notify us. If the organization's name has changed, or any information that has changed from when we issued the exempt organization certificate to the organization, again, contact the Sales Tax Exempt Organizations Unit. An exempt organization exempt purchase certificate may only be used to make purchases for the organization named on the certificate. It may not be used by any officer, member, or representative for personal purchases, and it may not be used to make purchases for a non-exempt entity. Exempt organizations may only make purchases exempt from sales tax if they provide a vendor with a properly completed exempt purchase certificate or other acceptable document. That means the certificate must contain the name and address of the vendor, the name and address of the exempt organization, the exemption number of the exempt organization, the signature of a responsible officer, the date the certificate is executed, and any other information required to be completed on that certificate. Again, as I said before, Form 119.1, the exempt organization exempt purchase certificate is not available on the department's website. You may call the Sales Tax Contact Center or the Sales Tax Exempt Organizations Unit to obtain additional copies. And if you could advance the slide again, please. Okay, sales by religious, charitable, educational, and other exempt organizations. The selling rules for these organizations are different. As I said earlier, school-related exempt organizations include private schools, PTAs, PTOs, youth organizations, booster clubs, model UN clubs, and various other school clubs, provided they applied and were granted exemption, and provided that they're not a governmental entity, that is the school itself. The rules for collecting and remitting sales tax for these types of organizations are different than the rules for sales made by governmental entities. As we discussed, pretty much everything is taxable when sold by the governmental entity or the school district. When products or services are sold by an independently organized school-related exempt organization, only the following sales of tangible personal property and services, food and drink, admission charges, and hotel occupancy are subject to tax. These sales are subject to tax. Retail sales of tangible personal property made by a shop or store, sales of food or drink entered by a restaurant, tavern, or other establishment. School-related sales under this section that are specifically exempt under the tax law include sales to a student of a nursery school, kindergarten, elementary, or secondary school at a restaurant or cafeteria, the same rules that apply to the governmental entities. And also sales made usually at college level through a meal plan. The sales must be made at a restaurant, tavern, or other establishment located on the premises of, in this case, a post-secondary school or college or university. And the school itself must be operated by an exempt organization or sanctioned by the state of New York. Some other services and products that are subject to tax are parking services, which is similar to the governmental entities' taxability of sales of parking services. Certain admission charges, sales of hotel occupancy, leases or rentals of tangible personal property, sales of certain utility services, and some of these things certainly don't come up with schools. Sales of services to real property, sales of tangible personal property made by remote means. These are some new sales that are subject to tax in the last few years. So those would be telephone sales, mail order sales, internet sales, and certain auction sales made at traditional and remote auctions. If we could advance the slide again. Oh, no, I think we're on the right slide. Sorry. Before I said sales made by a shop or store are subject to tax. An exempt organization's retail sales of tangible personal property made by any shop or store, including a temporary shop or store it operates, are taxable unless the item itself is tax-exempt, like food items, drugs and medicines, newspapers and periodicals, things that we discussed earlier that are exempt, or some other exemption applies. For example, the purchaser is exempt. A shop or store is any place or establishment where goods are sold from display with a degree of regularity, frequency, and continuity, and any place where sales are made through a temporary shop or store located in the same premises as persons required to collect tax. When an exempt organization operates a shop or store and also makes retail sales of similar but not necessarily identical items of tangible personal property by other means, such as by remote means, those additional sales are considered to be made by the shop or store, and they're subject to tax also. I think as far as school-related exempt organizations are concerned, exempt organizations are generally not going to be operating a regular shopper store. The school bookstore, for example, will probably be operated by the school itself and not by an exempt organization. Many times sales that appear to be made from a shopper store aren't shopper store sales because they don't meet the test of being held regularly, frequently, and continuously. Here's an example of a sale by an exempt organization that is not considered to be made by a shopper store. To use the example we previously used, the local elementary school holds an open house. At the open house, the PTA sells cookbooks from a table set up in the lobby. The PTA will only sell the cookbooks on the night of the open house. Sales in this instance of the cookbooks are not subject to tax because the store is not making sales on a regular, continuous, or frequent basis. We wouldn't consider that to be a shopper store, so those sales are exempt. An example of an instance where sales are considered to be made through a shopper store, in this case what we call a temporary shopper store, is the following. Same PTA rents a booth at a flea market where it sells the cookbooks. The proceeds from the sale are used to further the PTA's exempt activities. There are other vendors selling things at the flea market who are required to collect tax on their sales. Because of this, sales of the cookbooks are considered to be made from a temporary shopper store located on the same premises as persons required to collect tax. So in this instance, the sales of the cookbooks are taxable. All right, now we'll go to let's see here. Fundraising by exempt organizations. I think we're one ahead on this slide. I'm sorry, that was my fault, but we got a little ahead of ourselves. Much better, thank you. Unlike fundraiser sales by governmental entities, which are always subject to tax if the product being sold is taxable, in order for a fundraiser sale to be made by an exempt organization to be subject to tax, the sale must be made through a shopper store. So the same fundraising sale may be taxable when it's made by the school, but not taxable when made by an exempt organization, say, for example, a booster club. As long as the exempt organization and not an outside vendor is making the sale. We'll use the example of the candy bar sales that we had before. Say a model UN club that's an exempt organization that's received a number from us, contacts Hershey's and orders 20 boxes of candy bars. The school pays the distributor for the candy bars, so they become the property of the Model UN Club. The Model UN Club sale of the candy bars is not subject to tax because they're not setting up a shopper store to make the sales, and that's a distinction between these types of exempt organizations and the governmental entity where any taxable sale of products would be subject to tax. Car washes. We said earlier that when a school or a school club puts on a car wash, the charges are subject to tax, but the rules are different if an exempt organization that's issued an exemption number doesn't. If, for example, say a school booster club that's an exempt organization conducts a car wash, the charges are not subject to tax. And the reason for this is, under the tax law, only specifically enumerated services are subject to tax. I don't know if that's changed. Let me ask Tony. Has that changed with the revision of the tax law for services to tangible personal property? Is that one of the changes? Services to TPP?
No, services to TPP
has remained exempt. So,
yeah.
So in this instance, a car wash done by an exempt organization that's issued a number is exempt, but when the same car wash is put on by the school, it's subject to tax.
Right.
Sales of food or drink in a restaurant, tavern, or similar establishment operated by an exempt organization are subject to tax. Restaurant, tavern, or other establishment includes a dining room, bar room, cafeteria, snack bar, banquet room, a concession stand operated with a degree of regularity, frequency, and continuity. So we determine the taxability of restaurant sales of food and drink the same way we determine the taxability of sales made through a shopper store. Restaurant, tavern, or similar establishment includes any place where sales are made from a temporary restaurant, tavern, or other establishment located on the same premises as persons required to collect tax, and that's the same as the shopper store rules. Examples of temporary restaurant, tavern, or other establishments include concession stands, food trucks operated by an exempt organization at a county fair, church bazaar, or similar place. What's distinctive and what's controlling as far as the taxability is whether or not there are other vendors on the same premises that have to collect tax. Let's refer back to the example where the school holds the annual spaghetti dinner to benefit the extra class from activity fund. Since the school itself was selling the tickets to the dinner, in that instance, the tickets were subject to sales tax. Suppose instead of the school holding the dinner, the PTA, which is an exempt organization, holds the dinner. They use the school's cafeteria, but they provide the food, and PTA sells the tickets and keeps the proceeds. Since the PTA is holding only one dinner each year, it's not considered to be operating a restaurant or similar establishment, so the sales of the tickets aren't subject to tax. If instead, say, they held 4 dinners a year, we consider the PTA to be operating a restaurant or similar establishment on a regular, frequent, and continuous basis, and then all the sales of the tickets to every dinner would be subject to tax. In that instance, the PTA would be required to register for sales tax purposes and collect and remit sales tax. As I said, sales by an exempt organization at a temporary restaurant, tavern, or similar establishment located on the same premises as persons required to collect tax are always subject to tax, regardless of how many times it occurs. Okay. Say a student sports club that's an exempt organization and has a number from us, an exemption certificate, operates a stand where it sells hot dogs and soda for 1 week at a county fair. At that fair, there are other vendors required to collect tax that also operate food concessions and merchandise booths. In this instance, the hot dog stand is considered to be a temporary restaurant or other establishment because it's operated on the same premises as persons required to collect tax. So the exempt organization is required to register for sales tax purposes and collect and remit sales tax. Concession stand sales, and I think in a lot of instances, these may not be sales made by the school itself, but by one of these types of exempt organizations, say a booster club. I know it's that way in the school in my district. Sales made from a concession stand are subject to tax. I don't know if a lot of concession stands do collect tax, but that's the rule. Say a football booster club that's an exempt organization operates a concession stand during the months of September through November. The concession stand is considered to be a restaurant or other establishment, and sales of taxable items made from the stand are subject to sales tax. The booster club in this instance is required to register for sales tax purposes and collect and remit sales tax. Okay, I think we can advance the slide, please. Admission charges. There's a difference here, too, than with sales by the school district or governmental entity. Admission charges by an exempt organization are generally tax exempt. Say 2 high schools play a football game and the home team's booster club, which is an exempt organization, sells the tickets. The tickets to the game are exempt from tax as long as the proceeds benefit either the school or an exempt organization, in this case the booster club. I think the proceeds will always benefit one or the other, so these charges would be exempt from tax. Sale of admission tickets to a school dance or activity night are exempt from tax if the seller is an exempt organization. For example, as we said before, a PTA, and the proceeds benefit that exempt organization. So that's the distinction between sales by the exempt organizations and sales may be made by the school itself. Services to real property are subject to tax. This probably doesn't occur too often in a school environment, but suppose a school club that's an exempt organization decides to go out and mow lawns and do other yard work to raise money for the organization. Those charges are subject to tax. Remote sales. An exempt organization sale of taxable products is subject to tax where the sales are made by remote means and the exempt organization makes the sales, again, with a degree of regularity, frequency, and continuity. Sales made by remote means, as we said, include telephone, mail order, over the Internet, and other similar methods. Again, this is probably something that doesn't affect schools too often, but say if the school club, a PTA, etc., that's an exempt organization, regularly and frequently sells taxable products by phone or by mail order or over the Internet, if that's the case, the organization must register for sales tax purposes and collect and remit sales tax. Auction sales. Again, this is probably another situation that wouldn't occur often with school-related organizations. But if an exempt organization makes regular, frequent, and continuous auction sales, whether at a traditional auction or a remote auction, Remote auctions are auctions conducted by telephone, mail order, internet, etc. The sales of taxable products and services made at the auctions are subject to tax. For purposes of whether auction sales are frequent, more than two auction sales in a year are considered regular and frequent and would trigger tax. When an exempt organization conducts fewer than two auctions a year, the sales are not subject to tax, as long as the organization doesn't sell similar products in its shop or store, or the organization is not, the auctions, I should say, are not being held at a commercial auction house, which would put that into a taxable situation. Again, this probably doesn't come up often in school-related exempt organizations, but if it does occur, you need more information, again, consult our publication 843. Tony's going to talk about sales tax registration right now. If you make a lot of these sales and you're not registered, probably this is an instance that you may need to register and collect sales tax. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony and let him discuss the registration process.
So for the most part, any governmental entity or other exempt organization that makes taxable sales is required to register for sales tax purposes, to collect sales tax, file quarterly sales tax returns, and remit the tax to the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. The easiest way to register, which we prefer most people in the 21st century now, for sales tax is to go on the department's website at www.nystax.gov. Click on the Online Permit Assistance and Licensing OPAL web page. And then from there, you can certainly become registered online, and it would be the fastest route, and it would be, save paper and postage, etc. However, if you choose not to, you can always go online, our same website, www.nystax.gov, download a Form DTF, it's in Department of Tax and Finance -17, and that's called Application to Register for Sales Tax Certificate of Authority, and the instructions will be with it, and with the DTF, Department of Tax and Finance -17-I is important. That's the application to register instructions, and that will help you to fill out the form, and then you can mail it back to the New York State Tax Department Sales Tax Registration Unit at the W.A. Harriman Campus, Albany, New York 12227. Also, you should do this at least 20 days, but more than 90 days before beginning business, meaning if the school district isn't already registered, but I have strong suspicion that probably most of the school districts, at least in New York State, are already registered. There's a fair chance of that, and anybody, who needed assistance, can certainly contact the department, regarding this matter as well, as we have noted, and they could also, call the 800 number, which is, readily available here. I think it's 1-800-698-2909 from areas in the United States, which would be within New York State, and that's between 8 and 5 Eastern, Monday through Friday, and there's a lot of people, who have pretty, competent knowledge to help you, good folks, and when it involves the exempt organization unit, I deal with a lot of school districts and business people throughout the state and throughout the year, and I'm certainly happy to help out, and we're at 518-457-2782, and I have a few members of my staff one Tammy McGill and another Carolyn Thomas. They're happy to help out too, and they're usually in, by 8 every morning, and we have coverage a lot till at least 5 at night, 5:30 sometimes at least. So there'll be no problem with that, and okay.
Yeah, there's also another resource too. There's another publication that's the General Sales Tax Guide for sales taxes in New York State, and it's publication 750, a guide to sales tax in New York State. That's got a lot of information in it. It's got information about registering for sales tax purposes, filing your sales tax returns. Sales tax returns have to be filed quarterly in most instances. So if you need more information on the registration process and collecting and remitting sales tax, that's a good place to look. That's our general sales tax publication. Good. The slide advanced. Nice. I think I need to advance the slide one more time. There's a couple more things I'd like to go over before we run out of time, and then we can maybe Donna can read us off some questions, and we'll see if we can help you out with that. One of the things that I've been asked to discuss, and it's probably not real popular with the downstate school districts, is the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax. So we'll go over that just briefly. The Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax, or MCTMT, is a new tax imposed on certain employers and self-employed individuals engaging in business in the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation District, which is also known as the MCTD, and includes the counties of New York, Bronx, Kings, Queens, Richmond, Rockland, Nassau, Suffolk, Orange, Putnam, Dutchess, and Westchester. The tax department administers this tax for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. The Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax applies to public school districts within the MCTD beginning on and after September 1st, 2009. The tax applies to your school district if the district is required to withhold New York State income tax from wages, and the district's payroll expense exceeds $2,500 in any calendar quarter. The tax due is 0.34% or 0.0034 of your payroll expense for all covered employees for each calendar quarter. For most employers, your payroll expense is the amount of the employee's wages or other compensation that is subject to the Medicare portion of Social Security taxes. An employee is considered to be a covered employee if the employee's services are allocated to the MCTD. And to determine if the employer's services are allocated to the MCTD, you must apply the following tests in the order stated. If the application of a test results in the allocation of an employee's services to MCTD, the employee is a covered employee, and no further test may be used. So I'll go over that just briefly. Otherwise, you must proceed to the next succeeding test. The first test is localization. If an employee's services are allocated to the MCTD, if those services are either performed entirely within the MCTD or performed inside and outside of the MCTD. If this is the case, the employee is considered a covered employee and no further tests need be applied. The second test is base of operations, and employee services are allocated to the MCTD if the employee's base of operations is in the MCTD. And base of operations means the place where the employee is not continuously located, but from which the employee customarily starts out to perform his or her functions in or outside the MCTD. The base of operations is generally where the employee customarily returns in order to receive instructions from his or her employer. The third test is a place of direction and control, and an employee's services are allocated to the MCTD if the employee's direction and control emanates only from within the MCTD. Any employee performs some services within the MCTD. Direction and control means the place from which the employer directs and controls the activities of the employees, not necessarily the location of the principal's office or principal office, but rather the point from which basic authority over the supervision of services emanates. The last test is residence, and if none of the preceding tests results in a clear allocation of services, the employee's services are allocated to the MCTD if the employee resides in the MCTD and performs some services in the MCTD. Paying the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax. Public school districts have the option to report and pay the MCTMT by the following methods. They can either web file and pay quarterly through the tax department's website. They can file a paper form MTA 305, Employer's Quarterly Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax Return. They can file that quarterly and pay by check or money order, or they can use the prompt tax program only for school districts using prompt tax program for withholding tax purposes. Once a school district as an employer is required to file a quarterly MCTMT return, the employer must continue to file quarterly MCTMT returns for each subsequent quarter, even if there's no MCTMT due, unless the employer has permanently ceased paying wages subject to MCTMT. That almost wraps it up. Before I go into the contact information, there's a piece of legislation that's been recently introduced, and I just wanted to go over that briefly. I spoke with Steve Van Hoosen of the Association of School Business Officials today, and he brought this to my attention. It's a bill that was introduced in the Assembly, and I'll just go over this briefly. The purpose of the bill is to exempt certain school organizations from sales tax on certain items sold or resold and services provided for educational purposes. The purpose of this bill is to amend the tax law in relation to exempting certain school organizations from sales tax on certain items and services sold or resold for educational purposes. The purpose behind this is to allow these organizations that are recognized by the school to raise funds without the burden of collecting sales tax. And what this would do is it would amend two sections of the tax law. One of them, the section that provides for exemptions from the tax law, and it would also add a new section, a new paragraph to the section of the tax law that provides for certain exempt organizations, which are the organizations that we had just discussed. And the justification for this is, as they say in the memorandum in support of the bill, with the rising cost of education and cuts to school budgets on both the state and local level, parents and students are relying on fundraising efforts to help underwrite programs within the school. Currently, these groups are required to collect and remit sales and compensated use tax to New York State. These requirements are seen as onerous to the students and parents and often deter groups from engaging in efforts to raise additional funds for educational programs. So that's the intent behind this bill. What I can say with regard to this bill, I think similar legislation has been proposed in the past. Obviously, it has not been enacted into law, but in this case, I mean, certainly this could happen. But we just want to let you know that well before this is signed into law, we'll have an idea shortly before anyway, if it is going to be signed into law, and our office will prepare guidance, and we'll tell you exactly how this impacts your organization, because especially with respect to the public school districts, if this is signed into law, this will probably change most of what I discussed early in the presentation. I mean, in those instances, and it looks like in almost all instances, sales by the governmental entity or school district in this case, or even a club that exists independently, like an extra classroom activity fund, existing as a separate club, would be exempt from collecting sales tax on their sales of these fundraising items. So, again, we don't know where these bills are going to go. Some of them get signed into law, some don't. But if it does, we'll prepare guidance, and we'll let you know how to handle this and how to proceed moving forward. The only other thing I have is if we could advance to the last slide, I can go over quickly our contact information. I think I've probably got about 30 seconds left. But there's the tax department website. Again, it's www.nystax.gov. The Sales Tax Exempt Organizations Unit, which Tony Salerno is responsible for and capably runs. The main line into that unit is 518-457-2782. Again, my name is Jamie Johnson. I'm with Sales Tax Instructions and Interpretations, and I can be reached at 518-485-9795. That's my direct line. I know questions come up. We try to cover a lot of material in this presentation, but there are always going to be questions, and I don't want you to think that you're just out there alone. Certainly you can give us a call, and if we can't answer the question right away, we'll get off the phone and research it and find an answer and get back to you. So that's all I have.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tony and Jamie. Well, we have 16 questions.
Wow.
And I think they're going to take more than the 15 minutes that we have left. So what we'll do is any questions that we don't get to, we will take them and I'll send them to Jamie, and he and Tony can format a response, and then we will send them out to all of you.
That sounds good.
But let's start with our first one, and it's from Kathleen, and she says, you were talking about various forms at the beginning of the presentation, and she wants to know about Form DTF 17A.
That's a registration form, isn't it, Tony?
Right.
That's the, go ahead, I'll let Tony do that.
Yeah, the registration forms are, she can easily download that form on our website. That's if you're required to register and collect sales tax.
Right.
That's an application for a certificate of authority.
Yes.
Okay, so for a certificate of authority.
That's
certificate of authority to collect sales
right.
tax.
That's what they call the document that you need in order to be allowed by the state to collect and remit sales tax.
Right.
Okay. Now we have another question here, and this is from Mary LaValle Blaine, and she says, you mentioned that the purchase of motor fuel or diesel includes sales tax. Could you review the forms and process needed to claim a refund for these taxes paid, and how to determine the included tax?
You can definitely file for a refund because any purchases made by governmental entities are exempt from tax. And as I said before, the only reason they tax it at that point is because they can't back the sales tax out. As far as the sales tax, if you were to ask for a receipt, I think it would probably show the sales tax, Tony.
I think they'd have to somehow show it, of someone who sells it in bulk. I guess if you pull up to a pump to buy it, that's a different situation. But as long as you keep the records, I've run into a lot of these, and then the people file for a refund periodically, but they will get all the tax back. So,
and it may be something that we would help figure out on this end, our refund unit.
They'll do it. They do a ton of those here. So if you have any problem, give us a call, and I can certainly help her, and I'll get her on the right track fast, because I get a fair amount of them done.
Good, thank you.
No
We
problem.
have another question here from Lisa, and she says, I need clarification on the extra classroom activity funds. Are these purchases tax exempt?
Yes. We, as a tax department, we aren't really recognizing that the fund itself is a separate and distinct organization. And if we did that and we said that this is a separate organization that's kind of separate and apart from the school, they wouldn't be tax exempt. So the way we're looking at this is the school district itself is fronting the money. They're buying things. And as such, the school district is exempt from tax. So I guess we would equate the school district to the extra classroom activity fund. We wouldn't look at the extra classroom activity fund as a separate entity. If we looked at it that way, that fund would be required to pay tax just like everybody else. There would be no exemption available.
Right.
So I think we're looking at it more as the school district is buying things.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Now we have another question from Denise, and she says, any seminars I have previously attended state that the students are not tax exempt.
They're not. That's correct.
Right.
Students aren't tax exempt. Organizations in New York State are tax exempt.
Right.
But again, when we look at tax exemption, we're looking at who's making the purchase. Now, if this were students and only students and everything was separate and apart from the school district, if they were to go out and buy something in their name, that's not tax exempt.
Right.
But the way we're looking at this is the school has some oversight of these funds, and probably the school is controlling the funds. Now, if the school district itself goes out and makes the purchase, any purchase they make as a governmental entity is tax exempt.
Okay, now when you're saying and the school goes out and purchases these, what do you mean? Who does it mean that the teacher or advisor has to do the purchasing and not the students?
Yeah, well, On behalf of the school district, yes, certainly. Doing it that way, that's tax-exempt. Those are tax-exempt purchases. So if the teacher or an advisor of this extra class activity fund goes out and makes the purchases on behalf of the school district, and I think we can agree that all this benefits the school district, then those purchases are considered purchases of the governmental entity and they're exempt from tax.
Okay, but if the student officers of that particular club went out,
they're not tax exempt, and I don't know if that's the way things occur normally with these organizations. And I don't want to try to say that this is a good way to avoid the tax, but from where we were coming from, we're assuming that in most instances the school has oversight on this money, and maybe they're cutting the checks. And if that's the case, the school is exempt. If the students are controlling entirely these funds and doing everything on their own, they fall between the cracks, frankly. They're not the governmental entity, they're not the school district, and they're also not an exempt organization, unless, as we discussed, they were to file an application and become an independent organization, say a Model UN club, and it would probably take an advisor to put together the paperwork, file with us and get an exempt organization certificate and one of those 6-digit numbers that I'm sure everyone has seen, and then they can make purchases, and they can purchase anything tax exempt. But it wouldn't be the students per se, it would be the club comprised of students.
Okay, I hope that answers it all, Denise. If not, let us know.
Yeah, we can try to clarify it even further.
Right. Now, Kathleen says, how are local taxes submitted?
Well,
go ahead, Tony.
Local taxes are submitted the same way as state are. New York State Department of Tax and Finance administers state and local sales tax. Everything is sent directly to the New York State Tax Department.
Yeah, we apportion everything. We make sure everybody gets their share.
Right.
Okay. Now here's a question from Al Getter. And Al says, my Coca-Cola rep tells me that if a Coke product is sold in 12-ounce portions and is sold below 75 cents, the club does not have to pay tax on the sale. Is that true?
That's the vending machine exemptions, right?
It's a vending machine exemption that we've had. If it's sold to a vending machine in that manner, it isn't taxable.
Right, but I don't know in that instance, who owns the vending machines? Is it the school? It's not going to matter for purposes of the exemption, but or is it Coke? Does Coke come in and they sell the? Either way, if it's under 75 cents,
it's okay.
It would be exempt.
Maybe it's a vending machine, right, John? And that's what it must be. Coke drives in and puts it in a vending machine, right?
It could be.
If it's not a vending machine, then the rules are different.
If it's not a vending machine, it'd be taxable, meaning like if you go to, when I was a kid, if you like to the bookstore and buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, that's a different story.
Yeah, there's
There's
a specific exemption for vending machines and items that are sold for under 75 cents, and that may be what he's referring to.
That's what he's referring to.
Well, Al, if you press 7# on your phone, you can help us out on this question. Michelle, is he coming through?
I don't see him on there just yet.
No. Okay. Well, let's go to the next one, and maybe Al will get to us.
Yeah, we can get to another question at least.
Okay. Kathleen says, if the student council purchases Mardi Gras beads from their funds to pass out, not sell, during Spirit Week, can they use the tax-exempt form for the purchase?
I don't know. The student council, is it the school or is it a separate club? See, really what it comes down to in sales tax is who's buying.
That's all.
If the governmental entity, if the school buys, it's exempt. If the club buys and they've applied for a sales tax exemption certificate with us, then it's exempt. Otherwise, it's under the tax law, it's not recognized as any type of exempt entity. It's recognized as
a taxable purchase.
Yeah, a taxable purchase. A group of school children that are doing things on their own and don't have sales tax exemption.
Right.
Well, the student council is usually part of the school.
Right.
Yeah.
So probably the school's paying for it then.
And then it would be exempt.
Yeah.
Then it would be exempt. So that's why we recognized, or at least thought in preparing this presentation, that generally the schools are making the purchases. And if that's what's going on, those purchases are always exempt from tax.
Right.
Okay. Now, Jean says, in the Yankee Candle example that you gave, is the fundraiser responsible for tax on the profit made over and above what was paid to Yankee Candle?
I don't think tax should enter into the equation on that. I don't know what the agreement, how the agreement would be written, but tax is a separate thing. I mean, sales tax is a trust tax. They would just be collecting on behalf of Yankee Candle the tax that's due. So I wouldn't think that would affect their profit margin, but I think it would be wise just to pay attention to whatever the fundraising agreement is between Yankee Candle and the student group or the school.
That's the thing, Joe, that's because I think Yankee Candle, you're referring to it, I am bet $1 a dozen donuts, no pun intended, that the candle stand, what's happening here is that they have the co-vendor agreement, the Yankee Candle place, I believe, and the club just, the fundraising, the club just collects the money and remit it over. It doesn't affect their profit margin. I very much doubt it, or they wouldn't be doing it. Why would they even add the sale?
I can't imagine. It
doesn't affect it at all.
No, it shouldn't affect the school's profit margin at all. It's something that's separate and apart, and just a part of the sale in that, I guess we get our 8% cut or whatever.
Right.
That's what it turns out to, but it shouldn't affect the profit margin of the school.
They don't really. No, I've had a fair amount of those. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Now, Lisa says, our extracurricular clubs often purchase supplies, but they are also fundraising. Please clarify.
Well, you have two different things going on there. You have purchases, and again, we're going to look at it as if the school is making the purchase and the school's cutting a check, say, exempt. If you look at the other side, on a fundraiser, most of the fundraisers done by, again, the school would be subject to tax if it's taxable items that are being sold.
Right.
So it's two different sides of it. You got the purchase side and the sales side.
Okay. And Deanna says, you mentioned government entities paying sales tax on fuel and when they may be reimbursed. What about excise tax?
Yeah.
I don't think they're required to pay. That's not my area of expertise. Tony may know more.
Excise, there's also an exemption on the excise. What happens, there's a couple different ones for governmental, I believe, right on the web. One of them is Form AU, as in audit, -629, and there's for, refunds like excise, and the other one, the ST 946/1046, that they can get it back, because governmental get almost everything there is back, because there isn't really a purpose of the state tax in itself, if you know what I mean.
So the forms Tony referred to, those are specific forms for either fuel refunds or excise tax refunds.
Yes.
We have very specific forms for that.
Absolutely, there are here. Yep.
Okay, so that is refundable and there's a form for it.
Yes, there are.
Okay. Okay, we have 2 minutes, and we have one question from Marcia Jones, and it says, a student-based drama club purchases T-shirts for the students to wear to promote the production. The shirts are not purchased for resale. The county charges sales tax on clothing. Do we submit the county tax with our state tax?
Well, you're always going to, when a vendor charges tax, he's always going to charge the state and local amount if there's a local imposition for the clothing. So yeah, you would just pay whatever the receipt was.
Yes, but I must
but then
here's the thing. May I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Here's the thing. The school is paying for this, you say?
Yes.
The school pays. The school governmental entity. It's exempt. It's not subject to either state or local. Even though the county has a local tax on clothing, a governmental entity buying it, purchaser, user, consumer, no local tax. It's not taxable.
As long as it's a school, and again, that's the distinction. If it's a group of kids that aren't organized as the school, and it's not the school, then they don't get exemption. If it's the school, everything they buy is exempt from sales tax.
No local.
Okay, well, thank you. And we will get to all of the questions, and I'll ask Tony and Jamie to please submit written information for each of the questions here, and then we'll pass those out to you. But it will probably be next week before we can get all of that to you. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Jamie and Tony, and thanks all of you who were on this webinar. And we have a webinar on purchasing on Monday, and we have another one on closing out construction projects on Tuesday, and look forward to having you with us on those two webinars as well. Thank you, and enjoy this wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's New York State ASBO webinar. Thank you for attending.